Welcome to the eighth lecture in the SSCR Ideas online lecture series on COVID-19 pandemic, policy failures, and their impact on the lives of the people. We are. I'm happy to have with me today Professor Surajit Mazumdar. Professor Mazumdar is at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU. He's a macroeconomist whose interests are very wide ranging in the areas of political economy, macroeconomics, issues related to industry, businesses, and also public finance. So it's great to have Surajit with us. Uh, uh, he also happens to be at the moment secretary of Jawaharlal Nehru University Teachers Association. And apart from being a keen observer of the Indian economy, is also right in the midst of the teachers' movement in JNU. So welcome from Surajit. As usual, we'll have a lecture which for about 40-45 minutes, and then we take questions. The audience would put questions on the YouTube chat. I hope everyone's able to access the YouTube link. And then once the lecture is over, I'll give you the questions to answer. So there we go. Over to you, Shri.
Thank you, Vikas, and a very good evening to all of you, at least those who are in our time zone. I don't know if anyone from other time zones is also present. As the title of my lecture suggests, you can perhaps apply the analogy of the coronavirus affecting those with comorbidities more severely to the Indian context and in terms of its economic impact. That the coronavirus impact is not coming in the background of a healthy economy, but an economy which was already, in a sense, in a state of crisis. Let me begin by briefly placing where India stands within the global context in terms of the spread of the epidemic. Just to give some context to what we will be discussing subsequently. So if you look at the spread pattern of the COVID-19 pandemic, there seems to be a peculiar feature associated with it, which is that while it was something which originated in the eastern part of the world, in the heart of the East, as it has spread, the spread to areas immediately around the point of origin seems to have been much less. And as it has moved eastwards or southwards, the spread has been much less as compared to the movement westwards. Okay. So what you find is that as far as India is concerned, the effects of the pandemic in terms of the number of cases or deaths in India very much corresponds to what geography and economic status determine. Look at this table would make it clear that you can perhaps make India and Africa as interchangeable groups. Almost the same share in the world's population, almost the same figures with regard to the incidence of the epidemic. But what is interesting is that even East and Southeast Asia, apart from South Asia and Africa, if you exclude the Hubei province, particularly in China, seems to have been affected much less by the epidemic than the West. One can paraphrase Alice Amsden and say that the coronavirus has risen in the West, seems to have relatively spared the rest. The fact that South Asia and Africa are relatively less affected also means that countries with relatively low incomes have a relatively low incidence of the epidemic. So you find that India more or less corresponds to that particular pattern, where the effect of the pandemic directly itself seems to be much less. What is different, however, as far as the Indian case is concerned, is perhaps that India and Africa also, compared to East and Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, are a little behind in terms of the trajectory of the epidemic. So we still have a larger proportion of active cases as compared to the recovered cases, whereas East and Southeast Asia are, many of the countries there are actually countries where there is a downward trend, which means that the effect of the epidemic and measures to control it, to the extent that we can project from today's figures, would last much longer in India from when looked at from today than it would perhaps in other countries in the region. So that's one factor that one has to keep in mind, that the duration in which the effects of the epidemic and measures to control it may be seen in India may last beyond the period that they would have effects in other countries. What is also important to emphasize is that while other countries many of them are now showing a downward trend, in India of late, in the last 5 days, one has seen a bit of an upsurge, and a trend of slowing down in the spread of the infection seems to have been reversed in the last 5 days, when there is a significant spurt in the number of cases. So given that these effects reflect the effects that would be seen under extreme lockdown conditions, this is not the effect of the easing of restrictions, which began only on the 4th of May. The possibility that various measures required to contain the spread may also be in India, be operative for a fairly significant period of time beyond the 17th of May itself, which is till when the lockdown today has been extended. In addition to this, one other longer term factor one should keep in mind is that because the movement of migrants within India and migrants from India who work outside has been delayed or postponed because of the restrictions, it is going to be, both of these are happening or going to happen after, say, about 40-45 days of the lockdown have already been enforced, which means that you will have an added challenge of dealing with the possible effects of that on the number of people infected, and also some of the important economic consequences, in particular the flow of remittances, may be affected now for in the future for a longer period of time. Essentially, if you have delayed the movement back is also likely to be further delayed, and therefore there are effects of this epidemic which will last when beyond the restoration of any normalcy, even if that restoration does happen at some point of time within the year. Now, the important thing, however, to recognize is that the economic costs of successful containment are not necessarily less severe or significantly less severe than the economic costs associated with the failure to control it at an early stage. So you see that not only the European Union and the US, but also Asian economies in the first quarter of this year have shown significant contraction in their GDP. First quarter of 2020, what in India would be called the fourth quarter of 2019-20. Of course, there are differences. US and Europe are likely to face even greater contraction in the coming quarter, whereas China's most severe effect was perhaps in this period. So there will be some differences, but nevertheless, it's quite clear that the contractionary effects on the economy of even successful containment of the epidemic are pretty severe. And if one looks at the picture across the world and the projections made, no one is speculating that the economic impact of the coronavirus will be as disproportionate as is the effect in terms of the spread of the epidemic itself. So all across the world, contractionary effects are expected to in the coming 1 year, which comes on the wake of an already slowing down global growth, which has already been slowing down. Okay, so now as far as India is concerned, we do not have, of course, quarterly GDP data for the January-March quarter yet. It will come only by the end of this month. In any case, India's effects are would be most likely be after March, because we had our lockdown only on 25th of March, and by mid-March, India was still relatively small numbers of infected people, and so the restrictions that have been imposed in India as part of the containment effort have come relatively late, and therefore we should see more effects in the April to May quarter rather than in the January to March quarter. But even in March, if you see, while we don't have GDP data, we do have indirect indicators which are all suggesting that severe contractionary effects set in March itself, and the April figures are likely to be worse. So if one looks at consumption of petroleum products, in particular diesel, you can see there is a significant drop compared to last year. In India's trade values, both exports and imports, and this is not just because of oil prices, there is a significant contraction in trade. The movement of both people as well as goods on the Indian railways has also significantly contracted. Similarly, while we don't have the index of industrial production data for March for the entire industrial sector, we do have for the 8 core industries, and they all show significant contractionary effect. Sales of passenger vehicles, two-wheelers, and commercial vehicles, which are of course zero in April, but even in March there was very significant drop. And the traffic handled at Indian ports or the passenger traffic on airlines, all of them experienced a significant contraction. You can also see that so all these are indicating that there has been already in March significant contraction of economic activity in India, and of course April is going to be far worse, because the entire April the nation was under lockdown. Now, if you limited data that is available for April is we have from the railways. I'm not including passengers because passenger traffic was itself stopped, of course, but there's a very sharp drop in the the goods traffic on Indian railways also in the month of April. We have data for 20 days which are available. Vikas and Ankur have already demonstrated significant drops in the arrival of food commodities in mandis in the March 25th to April 14th, first lockdown phase, which is also reinforces the same point. The private sources of information, the purchasing managers indexed, which measures what's happened to activity in manufacturing and services relative to the previous month, and a value less than 50 indicates contraction. So manufacturing has contracted severely in April. Services had contracted even in, according to this index, contracted even in March, and there is a very, very sharp contraction that has been experienced in April. We also have the unemployment figures of the CMI, of course, with some difficulties in data collection because of the lockdown, which show that a progressively worsening unemployment situation has dramatically worsened immediately after the lockdown, with a huge increase in the unemployment rate, which is, of course, something not particularly surprising to all of us. Okay. Now, if you see the trends for earlier, you would of course see that while the March figures do show very sharp drop in all of these, the figures for the entire year, which are next to it, are also not looking very good. That is a year which ended in March 2020. And this is not only because of on account of March, and that's because, of course, we know that the Indian economy was already experiencing a slowdown from the fourth quarter of 2017-18, a successive slowing down had been taking place in the Indian GDP growth. However, I think one should look at the impact of the coronavirus is in the following sense, which is that it is the third successive shock that has been inflicted on India's economy, an economy which even before was not in a very healthy situation. The first shock was demonetization. The second was the introduction of the GST and the way it was implemented. And this is the third kind of shock that has been inflicted on the economy. The effects of that, in any case, were visible. That if you look at the India's new GDP series, according to that, from the year in the second half of which demonetization was introduced, there has been a progressive slowing down of GDP growth. But this growth, of course, is based on the new GDP series. If one, which is of course a controversial GDP series, and if one looks at alternative estimates of the growth rate before demonetization, Arvind Subramanian's estimate put it at about 4.5% per annum in the period up to 2016-17. So if one sees that, one sees a picture where the entire decade from 2011-12 onwards, India's GDP growth rate has slowed down, and that slowing down has been further reinforced by these three successive shocks, the third of which is still not had its full effect, whose effect we will see in the coming days. The decade-long picture that one can see so this was it, that the Indian economy was an economy which was already unhealthy. An unhealthy economy on which several of these shocks have been inflicted. So even if one forgets about the GDP growth figures and the controversies around it, there are several other indicators which show that the Indian economy was doing pretty badly even before demonetization took place. So industrial growth trends have been extremely poor throughout this decade, as indicated by the index of industrial production. The GDP series doesn't fully capture that process, but what we have seen already in 2019-20 is a near zero growth from a trend of continuous decline. That continuous decline in any case meant that the 2010s was the worst period of industrial growth in India in 4 decades. In 4 decades, we have not seen such poor industrial performance as we have seen in this particular decade. And even the new GDP series is not able to conceal the fact that along with agriculture, even the manufacturing sector's share in India's GDP is declining, and therefore GDP growth has become more and more dependent on services activities. Another sector which was very fast growing sector of the Indian economies in the 1990s and 2000s, which was construction, has also slowed down considerably in this particular decade, and a very slow growth has been witnessed throughout this decade. The slow growth of construction also is part of a story of a very dramatic reversal in investment trend in the Indian economy. Investment, which grew very rapidly in the period before the global crisis, has stagnated since, and the share of investment in India's GDP has been continuously declining throughout the decade, which is also reflected in both stagnation in the domestic production of capital goods as well as the imports of capital goods, which rose very dramatically in the period before the global crisis that took place towards the end of the previous decade. So the additional factor which has been there in this decade is that the significance of trade has been declining, both exports as well as imports, which means that India has not been able to find markets on which to expand its exports, and the slow growth of imports or the declining importance of imports in the economy only reflects the fact that the import using sectors of the economy are growing very slowly. So the signs of stagnation have been reflected in India's trade. And broadly speaking, if one looks at all the indicators of India's external economic interaction, exports, imports, India's trade in invisibles, as well as foreign investment, both portfolio and direct, one finds that throughout this decade, there's a picture of stagnation, very different from what we saw in the previous decade, where there was extensive, very significant growth in all these heads. So the stimulus coming from the international economy to the Indian economy has also been weaker in this whole decade, and signs of stagnation are visible there itself. Similarly, with bank credit, one sees that the growth of bank credit has slowed down considerably in this particular decade as compared to what we saw earlier. A significant slowing down has happened in India's bank credit growth. The impact of this has been, of course, felt on the also on already grim employment situation in India. So the exodus from agriculture, which began in the 90s with the onset of the agrarian crisis, the movement out of agriculture to non-agricultural activities is something, or an accelerated movement out of agriculture to non-agricultural activities is something that has happened even in this decade. But what is also significant in this particular decade is that the proportion of the Indian population which is working or employed, that itself has come down dramatically. I am, of course, using borrowed results here of the moderator of this discussion. So essentially, the employment crisis has worsened in terms of the work participation of the Indian adult population has come down. So not all of the effects of the employment crisis are captured by what we call normally the unemployed figures. And a lot of people have been saying that instead of looking at the proportion which is unemployed, it's better now in India to look at the proportion which is actually employed and working to get a sense of what's happening to the employment scenario. So the employment crisis is something that has, of course, worsened in this particular decade, that people have been forced to move out of agriculture, have not necessarily been able to find work outside agriculture. The consequence of which has been that the wage levels, or generally the returns to all laboring activity, whether self-employed laboring activity or wage labor, the returns to laboring activity have generally remained stagnant, even as the per capita income has grown, and grown in certain specific pockets or sectors of the economy. The effect of that on the distribution of and the stagnation has resulted in the fact that significant or 90% of the Indian population, which is dependent on one or the other kind of returns to labor for its earnings, has been stuck at extremely low levels of income from different sources. One gets almost the same picture, that the average earnings of 90% of Indians are extremely low, and they have tended to remain stagnant. So essentially, one has had a scenario where the deepening agrarian crisis and the forced movement out of agriculture has created an almost permanent labor market situation in which employment is limited. Large number of people are forced into low income self-employment or out of the workforce itself. And those who are employed, they are earning very little, even when they work in highly productive activities, in particular in the corporate sector. The earnings remain low because of the larger labor market situation, which is what has resulted in or underlined the sharp increase in inequality in India in the last 2.5 decades, where the top 10% of the population has seen its share rise, while the remaining 90% has seen a declining share in Indian income. Now, a lot of this was, of course, happening even before the present decade. And you can see the effects of that on the corporate sector, where the surplus component in the distribution of income increased dramatically. But a lot of that happened before this particular decade started. When this particular decade started, the effects of this kind of a pattern of distribution of income and the effects of income stagnation amongst large segments of the population started expressing itself in the inability of even the more productive sectors of the economy, which generated large profits because of the low wages, being able to sustain their growth because of the demand constraints arising from the narrowness of the market within India and the failure to be able to generate export growth. This is what underlay the slowing down of investment also, or stagnation of investment, which only served to reinforce the demand constraint. Of course, none of this solved the employment problem. They, of course, meant even further aggravation of the employment problem. And that's what one has seen as a process that has happened throughout this particular decade. So in that scenario of that was emerging, or you have the effects of demonetization, then the introduction of the GST, and then the effect of the coronavirus. And the effects have been there in all parts of the economy. Now, the implication of this is that if you look at the situation of the Indian economy before the coronavirus impact comes, before the COVID-19 impact comes, if it was really already in a situation where it was almost on the verge, if not already, into a phase of contraction, then you're going to have, as a result of the effects of the lockdown and other measures to contain the spread of the epidemic, you're going to have, as a result of that, a further contraction. But once you return to normalcy, even after that particular contractionary phase is over, it is not going to be even a restoration to the earlier level, but the new kind of equilibrium level is likely to be lower than what it was before the impact of the pandemic or the epidemic was felt in the economy. And the reason is this, that on the one hand, you've had a large segment of the population, either because it is unemployed, cannot find work for the sufficient number of days in the year, or if it finds work, earns very little out of that work, whether you work in agriculture or you work in non-agricultural activities. You have such a large segment of that population facing, as a result of this impact, a further impact on their contractionary effect on their incomes. There is no way that their incomes will automatically come back to the original levels once the economy is able to go back to normal, in the sense of the specific restrictions associated with the coronavirus no longer being enforced. So when you go back to normal, you're going to go back to in a situation where a significant part of the population would have seen a severe shrinkage of their incomes, incomes that were already low. So as far as that segment of the population is concerned, which is a very large segment of the population, there is no scope for the easing of restrictions to express itself in the form of pent-up demand. Pent-up demand now leading to significant increases in expenditure or demand. So there is no pent-up demand in this period for large segments of the population. Instead, the level of demand, there's a collapse of their demand, and that collapse will persist beyond the existing period of restrictions when you face the direct effects of the coronavirus and the restrictions that they have called for. So there would be a demand contraction which from 90% of the population, which will persist into the period after the restrictions are over. So even if you remove on constraints on supply, if the supply chains can be restored, there are no impediments to the production and trade and distribution of goods and services. Even then, there will be the effect that the level of demand that would be existing in that economy will be far less than the level of demand that existed before the effects of the pandemic were felt. And that reduction will be coming on the back of an already existing severely demand constrained situation. A second effect of all this period and the restrictions they will call forth will be on the financial system, because the lack of earnings in this period, and earnings during this period will mean that significant number of enterprises, whether of own account enterprises or enterprises using hired labor, whichever be the sector that is affected, the large number of enterprises, their financial situations will be worsened by the effects of this period of restrictions or inability to engage in economic activity. The consequence of that will, of course, be that many of them may not be in a position to easily restore or go back to the production levels of the past or to resume economic activity even when all the restrictions end. An additional impact will be, of course, on the if enterprises are not able to generate earnings or resources, then their ability to repay their debt will also be affected. The consequence of that will also be felt in the banking system and the other parts of the financial system. The lending institutions' financial health will also, in a sense, be adversely hit by this period of constraints or restrictions. So even in that sense, one is not going to be going back to a kind of normal situation. Given the demand constraints that would already be existing, it is, of course, means that significant amount of excess capacity will exist even once the restrictions on production, even when they fully disappear, and therefore the incentive to invest or to expand capacity will be even weaker as compared to the situation that existed beforehand. So the consequence will be that every component of the economic situation which was holding back or which was responsible for the successive process of slowing down of the Indian economy, successively affecting different sectors, slowing down output growth, aggravating the unemployment situation. Every one of those components will be much more severe than in the period before the. To add to that, one might see an additional effect, which is partly indicated by what we saw in the case of the services purchasing managers index, which is that Indian growth has been significantly dependent on services for a long period of time. And that has been even more the case in the previous decade, in the decade that is ending now, than earlier. So if now, what is likely is that the effects of the restrictions and the effects of behavior patterns that the fear about the epidemic, which can last for a long time, will bring about is that segments of services in India will also be able to find it more difficult to sustain their growth. in the manner than they had been able to do earlier. So there's an added new element coming from the specific effect that the epidemic and the effects that it has on important services sectors will bring about, which may take a little longer to go away than other effects that flow from the specific restrictions being imposed on production. So it's not likely that even if all restrictions are removed, that retail trade, hotels and restaurants, tourism, several of these things will be restored to their original levels quickly. We also are likely to see the effects of the contractionary effects of that the global economy is going to experience are also going to reflect themselves here. And if one looks at the period following the global crisis, then one can see how that global crisis itself had significantly reduced the expansionary impetus coming from the global economy. And one is likely to see a further effect of that even as one goes ahead in the period after the restrictions are removed. So in all senses, the severity of the economic crisis that India has been facing is going to be much greater in the coming period than was the case just before the effect of the epidemic was felt. The added dimension or the important dimension of this severity is that if one looks at the history of this particular crisis, it's a crisis in which the crisis has in a sense spread from one part of the economy to another, sometimes over a long period of time, sometimes very quickly. But there's been a kind of spread that has happened. So you find that the sector which first expressed, where you first had the expression of the crisis, was the agrarian sector. The agrarian crisis is in a sense the first of the crisis. That produced the employment crisis, and the increasing severity of that crisis was felt even in periods of relatively rapid growth. Once the demand effects of this started expressing themselves, there was a crisis of investment, or accumulation and growth, and also of profits. This particular effect also, these effects became more severe on the unorganized sector of the economy with the effects of demonetization and GST. And then they started spilling over onto even the organized sector. The effects of the coronavirus and the measures taken to contain it on all of these segments is going to be adverse. And therefore, there is a question about where does the any attempt to restore the health of the economy after this pandemic's effects have passed away, the direct effects have passed away, where does the effort to restore any kind of normalcy, where should it focus on? Now, if one looks at history, that throughout this decade, when we have been seeing this slowing down of the signs of a crisis in the Indian economy growing year by year, throughout this period, the government in India has been not so much concerned with the health of the economy, but with its so-called own financial health. That effect seems to be there even today. Just today, the government has put out information on the financial assistance that has been provided to India's poor as part of the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, as part of the effort against the coronavirus epidemic. Now, if one looks at the financial assistance that has been given, firstly, it has been given to, according to that, the government's own admission, to 39 crores people in India, which is less than a third of the Indian population. Certainly not the only segment of and 1/3 of the Indian population is by no means the segment which has been adversely affected by the lockdown. The figure of the total assistance given also amounts to less than 900 rupees per month for 39 crore people. Forget about those who have not received anything. Even for the 39 crore people, the average amount received as per this financial assistance for up till 5th May, which is from 25th March to 5th May, this whole period of about 40 days of the lockdown, the total assistance received has been less than 900 rupees per person. So this is the scale of assistance that the government of India has been providing, which is reflecting, of course, the fact that it's preoccupied with its own financial health. And somehow concerned primarily with still the question of balancing its revenues and expenditures, balancing them in a way in which it keeps the tax burden on India's rich and property relatively low. This is the feature that has been there throughout the present decade. So if one goes back to the global crisis, when the global crisis erupted, India, like everyone else, also had a fiscal stimulus package. That fiscal stimulus package, of course, that is a stimulus package that came in a background of a boom in the world economy and in India. This is a very different situation that we are confronting today. It's not a crisis that has emerged in the back, which reflects the collapse of a boom. It reflects a crisis that is aggravating an already existing crisis. Now, if one looks at the fiscal stimulus package in India, even at that time, was relatively small and was dominated by tax cuts rather than expenditure increases. And very soon as the deficit went up, there was concern about the financial health of the government. And from the beginning of this decade, no matter what was the state of the Indian economy, no matter what the situation, that investment was stagnating, agriculture was in crisis, employment crisis was deepening, industrial sector was stagnating. Through all of that, the single-minded effort of the government was to try and reduce the fiscal deficit. And much of the success in that was achieved through essentially a reduction in expenditure or compressing of expenditure, because on the revenue side, the recovery was poor. And except for a short period when they took advantage of the decline in oil prices to generate some more revenue, the revenue position in India generally remained extremely poor and stagnant. So the burden of the reduction of the fiscal deficit fell on the expenditure side. But in the last 2 years, even that effort has run into a problem because of the adverse effects of revenues of the slowing down of the Indian economy. So in 2018-19 itself, one saw a very slow growth of actual revenues, much below what was estimated, and even below the nominal rate of growth of Indian GDP. So in 2018-19 itself, the government had to actually compress expenditure below budgeted levels in order to try and meet the fiscal deficit target. 2019-20, which ended in this March, has of course been a disaster, where in terms of revenue collections, the picture appears to be that there's been zero growth of revenues. For the entire year, we have figures for GST collections that they themselves are below 4%, and other because of certain other concessions given in corporate taxes, other revenue growth is poor. And therefore, you've had a situation where total revenue collections of the central government, and this also indicates what's happened with the state governments, was already stagnating, that there was no growth in the revenues even in last year. On this will come the impact of the contractionary effects that we are seeing now. We will see the impact of that on the in the form of a complete collapse of revenues. As Vikas said when I informed him that unlike the normal pattern, where on the first of every month, the previous month's GST collections are reported by the government. When I informed him that there was no report has come this time, on the 1st of May, he said, what will they report? Which is a fact, because the indirect reports from state governments are from different state governments, including Delhi, which where the chief minister made a statement a few days ago, that GST collections in April have come down by about 80 to 90% for the states. And obviously the central government will also be seeing a similar situation. So a complete collapse of revenues is in the offing. And if that is going to be the case, then what happens in terms of expenditures if the economy is to be revived in the period after these effects come down? If one goes by what the government has been willing to do, even in this period, it appears that the balancing of the books and the maintenance of the principles of sound finance is still an important preoccupation with the government, which is why it has not been willing to spend. It has not been willing to support state governments in this effort to beat back the epidemic. So if that is the case, then the fiscal situation, the fiscal crisis is going to be extremely severe going forward. And there will be competing demands for stimulating the economy, demands for tax cuts, demands for expenditures, okay, in the coming period. And if one goes by the experience of the past, the bulk of the stimulus in the efforts of the government of India are likely to be concentrated on the corporate sector and the top 10% of the Indian economy, of supporting them, supposedly that through their efforts, because they are the ones who are supposedly the ones who will eliminate poverty, through them, the others would be benefited. Whereas the real requirements may be quite the opposite. So so the fiscal question is something that is going to become very important in the coming days. It's not just a question of what is spent today, but what is going to be the pattern of expenditure in the past. So in a sense, what the epidemic has done is to bring even more sharply to the fore the underlying structural reasons for India's economic crisis, brought to the fore the necessity of intervention to redress the extremely sharp inequalities that the Indian economy has experienced. But whether that will be something that the government will choose to do or not, will it make that fundamental decisive break with the past or not, remains to be seen. The evidence of the last 1 decade and the evidence of what the government has done in this period does not generate much hope that it will make that decisive break. So therefore, it is extremely grim times that the Indian economy may be in for. And the efforts to revive the economy, whether even in the sense of GDP growth, profits, whether it will succeed in reviving or not, one doesn't know. But if the effort is concentrated or focused on the top 10%, on the corporate sector, and strengthening their ability to expand economic activity and to lead the growth process and to lead the employment expansion process, if that is the focus, whether it will succeed in even generating GDP or profit growth or not is doubtful. As far as resolving the crisis for the majority of the Indian population is concerned, it is definitely not something that is going to produce the desired results. So with that, let me pause or stop and take any questions that people may have.
Thank you, Surajit, for this very interesting and comprehensive overview you gave of the economy. There are quite a few questions. Surajit, can I request you to turn the screen off, that screen share?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. So there are quite a few questions. A lot of questions related to different aspects of the economy. I'll try and sort of organize them into different themes to see how well I can do it. There are some questions about demand, inflation, employment, and so on. Let's take those first. So Prachi has a question. RBI governor's statement is that inflation is receding and may well be under 4%. Policy is to increase liquidity that will increase inflation. With demand crunch, how does this impact the economy? Jessim has a question. Why doesn't anyone in the government realize that the low levels of inflation that we are seeing and are likely to see in the coming months is not healthy and clearly due to a steep decline in demand? Then America has a question. Is wage-led demand growth the way out? If yes, what government policies can facilitate it? And something similar, given the high rate of unemployment before COVID-10, obviously this pandemic will aggravate this rate further. What would be your suggestion for generating more employment? Over to
Okay, I think all the questions are more or less kind of linked. Yes, it is true that the reason why you don't have high inflation in India is that there is a problem of demand. If one goes back, most of the high inflation in the period before this low inflation period emerged was in any case because of food price inflation. So it's not that the availability of food to the Indian population is something that has improved in this decade, and therefore food inflation has come down. Instead, it is the effects of demand compression. And food demand is something that is significantly affected by the income level of the 90% of the population. So it's a compression of demand there, which is holding down, which has held down prices generally in India, or brought the inflation rates down. So it's absolutely clear that it is the earnings of those who labor, okay, those who depend on laboring activity to earn. It is the compression of their earnings which underlies India's so-called success in controlling the inflation rate, which is in a sense solving the problem by recreating it in a different. So that's demand. And that problem of demand, however, is not limited to only the effects on food demand. That problem of demand is also something that is one of the most severest constraints operating on the expansion of the industrial sector, because industrial demand is particularly adversely affected by this. The relatively prosperous in India are still able to sustain some bit of demand for growth of services, but not for the manufacturing or industrial sector. So the industrial sector is one of the worst hit, and which is also makes it more and more difficult to absorb the surplus that the low wages themselves can generate in terms of investment, because the industrial sector is a major absorber of investment in a way that most services cannot. So it is true that this is the source of the problem. And the experience has shown as clearly as any evidence could show that the continuous efforts of getting over this problem by inducing private capital to invest and expand, by improving the business climate, the ease of doing business, and so on, and the refusal to step up public expenditure and the refusal to use fiscal policy to redistribute income from the 10% to the rest, has not produced the results that were being expected. It is simply in the whole decade has gone by and you have not had that revival of investment. So if that is the path that is pursued, you will have a similar failure, but now a failure under conditions which are far more grim than were there before. If at all it can be more grim. This institution was pretty grim even earlier. Now, as far as the so-called, so therefore, what has to be done is to make the efforts to induce an expansion of demand in a way that also leads to increases in employment and increases in returns to laboring activity. So if you spend on agriculture, if you spend on activities which generate employment, if you and there are several activities in India where there's scope to spend, where you increase the where there's a deficit in terms of availability for the population, where if you increase both the availability of these services as well as you increase employment, which in turn will have multiplier effects. Key part of that is, of course, spending in different ways to support the agricultural sector, because as long as agriculture remains depressed, unable to generate incomes for large sections of the population, to sustain the agrarian households, and there is this large push outside agriculture, there will be strong tendencies to reduce not only the returns to work in agriculture, but also returns outside agriculture. So it is really an expansion of expenditure on investment in infrastructure, expansion of investment, expansion on the social sector, expansion on agriculture, overlapping areas like this kind, which are the desperate need of the hour. However, I would emphasize that this has to be accompanied by more aggressive taxation of the corporate sector and higher income groups in India, because unless you do that, eventually the burden of this will fall on the ones on whom you are supposedly trying to benefit. So it has to be accompanied by increased taxation. And if this is to be done, then in some ways one has to insulate the Indian economy from the effects of globalization, particularly the international finance, because you can say in many ways India has been lucky to escape a currency crisis throughout the decade. If it were to take measures of this kind, international finance is likely to react adversely to both high taxation as well as high expenditure, and the state taking on a larger role. And if those effects are to be checked, then one has to insulate the economy also from those external effects. So I think that's broadly the direction in which one would have to think in terms of going forward. But as I said, the big challenge is that any such effort is up against very powerful forces, both within the Indian economy as well as internationally.
Surajit, there are in fact quite a few questions on the whole issue of government revenue. But before I move on to that, there are sort of two extensions to the whole question of demand that I would like you to take on. So the question is, why does demand constraint not bother a typical Indian policymaker? And an extension to that, is it not surprising that demand constraint does not bother the large private corporate sector, which in some sense is dependent on this demand for its profit?
Okay, why does it not bother them? Well, I don't think it doesn't bother them. That's not correct to say that it doesn't bother them. But the question is that when it comes to doing something about a demand constraint, if the problem of addressing the demand constraint has to work through ways which are going to raise the returns to labor, which means raise wages, then the effect, then the interest of the corporate sector in one direction comes up against the interest in the other direction. And their instinct is to prefer low wages rather than high wages. So even if they are going to look for ways to expand demand, they want to think of ways of expanding demand which would not have this effect of increasing wages. The second is that that the increase in expenditure on the part of the state also means that it takes on a larger role in the economy. It becomes the provider of several services. Even today, for example, in India, the private sector, even in healthcare, doesn't want to be out of the picture, doesn't want a situation where it wants to be out of the expansion of public health to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, that it should be kept out of the game. It's not something that it wants. So in general, the private sector doesn't want that the government should become capable of providing a large quantum of services. It would rather prefer that the government supports the private sector in the provision of these services. So they would rather have health insurance rather than the expenditure to provide health services. And of course, all of this means that and they don't want to necessarily pay higher taxes. They don't want to pay higher taxes. So the same logic of wanting more profit, only one part of that is demand. The other part is what do they have to pay for the workers they have to hire to produce the profit, and what taxes they have to pay. So that's only one part of it. They would want a solution to the demand problem, which would not involve constraining them in terms of profit earning opportunities or implying that they have to pay higher taxes. And so they are going to look for a stimulus, but they're going to look, so they are also talking about, corporate sector is also talking about a stimulus. So on the face of it, everyone is saying economy needs stimulating. Everyone is saying the same. But unfortunately, they are not all exactly saying the same thing. They have different meanings. So corporate sector would want that they get tax concessions. Have you heard any one of them say they'll donate to PM CARES fund? But have you made any one of them said that the corporate tax concessions given in the middle of the previous year should be withdrawn because the corporate sector would like to support the nation's effort against the epidemic? They're not saying that. They're probably going to say, give us some more concessions. So the question is that when you are trying to stimulate the economy, there is a conflict of interest. There are different notions of what stimulating the economy means depending upon which part of Indian society is talking about a stimulus. So as far as the corporate sector is concerned, and because of their influence on government, it's become an ingrained thinking of government, and this coincides with the worldwide wisdom propagated by international finance. So all of them come together. That's why I said we are up against very powerful forces when one is talking about this. Otherwise, frankly speaking, less than 900 rupees per person to 39 crore, to less than a third of the Indian population as the financial support in 40 days of a lockdown is absurd. Why is that the case? Why is it that the government is not willing to be a little bit more generous as far as this is concerned? Because it is looking at what's going to even if you look at some people who argue, like our former RBI governor has argued that you do make spending today, but it will not be a problem if you give a clear assurance to financial markets that tomorrow, once the normalcy comes back, you will ensure that the fiscal prudence is restored. So you can spend today a little bit, you can forget about the fiscal deficit temporarily, provided you assure financial markets that tomorrow you're going to take it doubly seriously. Then it's okay. Then no one is going to be in a problem. Capital is not going to fly away from India. It'll be all fine. You can continue to do, you can do what is required today. Okay. But what does that mean? That means you spend a little bit today, but tomorrow, who do you recover it from? You either recover it from the poor through the taxation on them, or you recover it from them by slashing expenditures which bring benefits to them under some heads. So you basically replace expenditure for the benefit that would have happened tomorrow with the expenditure today, or you give them a certain benefit today and recover it from them tomorrow. Okay, so that's the approach that is the preferred approach to fiscal stimulus that is there. But as I said, that's not whether that's going to even restore the economy is doubtful in my view. Experience shows that it will not. And certainly it's not going to resolve the problem for the large majority of the Indian population. So for them, the choice that is being faced is, okay, you are already in a crisis. The crisis has become that much greater today. You were at 50, now you are at 20. I'll bring you up to 30, but tomorrow you'll have to stay at 40. That's the kind of choice that is being offered to the Indian.
Now, let's go on to the questions on the issue of revenue mobilization. So there is a question: if the present government does not tax the rich to cover for the crisis for their political reasons, is there any other fiscal measure that can help, given the scale of expenditure that is needed? And a related question: is fiscal space the major problem, or is it the political will to rescue the livelihoods of the people of the poor? Kerala has managed the situation in spite of a constraint on their budget. Then there is a question on monetization of deficit. Is monetization of deficit a way out to address the crisis? If it happens, given the supply constraints, would it jeopardize the economy by way of creating inflationary pressure? Then, is there any chance that government could divert budget from areas like defense and also money spent on publicity into money that can be used for building health infrastructure or economic package for the masses? Then there's a question about the impact of taxes on capital mobility. And finally, your views about the forced report, which this IRS officers have come up with.
Can you repeat the last one?
There's a question about what do you think of the force report, that the report prepared by those 50 IRS officers?
Okay, so let me say this, that firstly, there is no case for the requirements, that additional requirements that the present situation has, the epidemic has created, to be met by basically or fundamentally by diverting expenditures from other heads. Largely or mostly in most areas, expenditure in India is too little compared to requirement, and therefore it has to be an expenditure increase rather than an expenditure shift that has to be the main way of meeting this. The financing of that immediately can be met by monetizing, by basically borrowing from the Reserve Bank. And immediately, if required, that is the way that one has to go, because in the middle of all of this, of course, taxation, a higher taxation cannot be the way. But ultimately, someone has to pay for this. And the only way I can see is that simply a stepping of expenditure will not be the solution to the problem. It will mean higher taxes have to be imposed on the rich and the wealthy, which means increasing the weight of direct taxes in Indian tax revenues. And this additional revenue is not only required by the central government, it also is required in order to provide support, adequate support to the state governments. Yes, Kerala has been successful in terms of controlling the epidemic. But has anyone quite exactly considered what is the cost the Kerala economy has paid in order to be able to achieve this? what are the requirements that Kerala's economy will have in the coming days in order to revive itself. So certainly the more resources are required. If you have the necessary political will and you have the necessary space, fiscal space is not a given. Fiscal space is also a result of policy decisions. So if you are willing to consider, if you are not willing to consider taxes in the future, if you are not willing to consider capital controls in the future, then your notion of what fiscal constraints you have today will be very different from if you are willing to consider these options. Okay. If you consider these options that you will be able to eventually finance what you have to spend today and tomorrow through higher taxation, then you have fiscal space. Okay. And then you wouldn't be bothered if you have to monetize part of the deficit, part of the expenditure today by essentially borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India. So fiscal space is also a matter of political will, whether you wish to create that fiscal space or not. And then comes the question of how you utilize that particular resource effectively. Or so yes, Kerala is showing a way of how you might use this most effectively, whatever resources you are spending. But that does not mean that the spending by the government of India and by the state governments together in India on dealing with the epidemic and its economic consequences are adequate. That just because in Kerala it's been possible to bring the level of, to essentially suppress the spread of the epidemic, and Kerala has now fewer than 40 cases which are still under treatment. Even if that has been true in Kerala, it doesn't mean that you could have had the same effect across the country with the same level of expenditure that the country as a whole has borne. And Kerala's economy will still be paying a very high price for this measure. You add to that the fact that people from Kerala who are outside, who have lost their jobs or want to come back home, they are going to come back, and the flow of remittances, which is also important to Kerala's economy, is something that will be adversely hit. So it's an economy which is going to be very badly hit. It's a state government whose revenues are going to be very badly hit. It will need much greater support from the central government in the coming days. And unless the fiscal space is created by a willingness to increase taxation in the future and to borrow from the RBI today, Kerala's success in terms of dealing with the epidemic will also come with a very, very heavy price in terms of the economy. And for the rest of the country, you will have a worse situation in terms of dealing with the epidemic, but you will also have a very severe economic effect. So that's the point I was trying to make at the beginning, that the economic costs of containment are not necessarily inversely related to the success in containment. That if you have not contained it, you will have greater damage. If you've contained it, you will have lesser damage. Not related to the success in the containment. That's not necessarily true. So that if you've contained it, the economic costs are going to be less. So the economic costs are going to be there. Very severe costs are going to be there unless the government is willing to. Unless the government at the least is willing to abandon forever and abandon decisively this consideration of maintaining the principles of sound finance, maintaining targets set out in the FRBM Act. Unless that is abandoned, that's the minimum requirement to prevent what are going to be perhaps catastrophic consequences for India's economy.
Yeah, unfortunately, you could actually have the converse. That is, you fail in containing and you destroy the economy. So you could actually
can have both. Yeah, you can have both.
you can have both.
Yes,
Which is perhaps
absolutely.
what the central government is heading towards. So,
Yes,
so
as I said, we are not
yeah.
clear. We have been even able to control. So we might have various measures supposedly to control it without the expenditure support happening for a long period of time. So the adverse consequences of so there will be adverse consequences of failure to control it. It becomes a more prolonged process of trying to control it. And through the prolonged process, the efforts to control it will keep having impact on the economy. Okay. So you might therefore actually end up getting both a worse situation as far as the epidemic itself is concerned and a worse situation as far as the economy is concerned.
There are a couple of questions on the manufacturing sector. Pooja is asking a question: manufacturing sector, which already witnessed negative rate of growth of employment in that 2017-18 survey on account of unorganized manufacturing sector, but which manufacturing subsector will have to bear the most of the burden of the crisis due to the COVID pandemic? And what can government do to particularly in respect of the manufacturing sector? So that, and then there is a question specifically on the MSME sector. Since the MSME sector in India is highly dependent on circular flow of capital to function and does not have any protection or deep pockets, what do you think the government could do to protect the MSME?
Okay, now as far as the industrial sector is concerned, the experience is that as far as the industrial sector is concerned, all segments of Indian manufacturing have, if you see it over a long period of time, been doing poorly. Within that story, of course, it is true that and this didn't start only in this decade, but in the previous decade, within this, the unorganized manufacturing has been more badly hit. And with the effects of demonetization, GST, that process has got pushed further. And that's the reason why manufacturing employment, which was largely in the unorganized sector, has been doing badly for the decade and a half at least. So within if you look at the organized and unorganized division, the unorganized sector has been badly hit in the past, and it will continue to be very badly hit going forward. So relative to the organized manufacturing, unorganized manufacturing will be more adversely hit. And as new regimes come into place to deal with things like this crisis created by the epidemic, let's say, for example, safety measures, standards, and regulation for that, all of them are also likely to contain an inherent bias against the unorganized sector of Indian manufacturing. So that will tilt the balance further in favor of organized manufacturing. But even organized manufacturing has not been doing very well throughout the decade. And the worst hit has, of course, been the capital goods sector because of the collapse of investment over so the capital goods sector, significant parts of the consumer goods industries, all of them have been doing badly because of the problems of demand. So in terms of the final products, both consumer goods and particularly consumer durables and capital goods have been hit badly by the demand constraints. And they in turn means, of course, that other intermediate goods and basic goods industries are also adversely affected as a result. So as far as the industrial sector is concerned, the industrial crisis in India is widespread. There are maybe a few exceptions here and there, but they have also been not being able to sustain that. So the automobile industry may have been an exception for a period of time, but we've seen that it's been one of the worst affected by the slowdown before the crisis. The pharmaceutical industry, yes, has been relatively doing better, both in terms of international competition as well as in terms of relative to the rest of the manufacturing. So there are exceptions here and there, but overall the picture of the manufacturing sector is that most of the manufacturing sector in India has been doing poorly. And it's not a crisis limited to a specific segment, a specific part of the industrial sector. It's a crisis of the industrial sector as a whole. What was the second question that you had, Vikas? Just
This was about the MSME sector.
MSMEs. MSMEs. Okay. So if one looks at MSMEs, for example, one very important indicator to look at is, for example, what has happened to bank credit to the MSME sector. Within the MSME sector, if you particularly look at the industrial part of it, then for one whole decade, you find that there's been very little growth of credit to this particular sector, despite various schemes announced by the government, which are often rehashing of existing things. The actual flow of credit has been badly hit. Now, of course, so many enterprises in the MSME sector were already in an extremely fragile position before this crisis hit. Okay. So as far as MSMEs are concerned, in general, the proportion of enterprises which were in fragile condition in them were larger, was higher than in the relatively larger industrial sector or in the corporate sector. But fragile enterprises existed in all segments of the all segments itself. And when this crisis hits the revenue flow to these enterprises, then many of them are likely to be crippled permanently by the effect of this. So therefore, the MSME sector in particular, okay, the MSME sector in particular, because there are it's a very small part of the Indian economy. If you look at even the corporate sector, the 60% of corporate profits are in the hands of not more than 350 companies. Okay. Whereas more than 9 lakh companies file income tax returns. Okay. But 300 to 350 odd companies account for 60% of all profits. So the deep pockets, even in the corporate sector, are highly concentrated. And much of what was technically the corporate sector in terms of being organized through joint stock companies is also in a not so very healthy situation. So for all these sectors, what will be important is, of course, is that to find ways of supporting them financially to overcome the effects of this particular crisis, which come in the background of an already serious situation inherited from the past. So financial support, credit support of some kind or the other is something that would be required for these enterprises also. But that also requires, again, because you can't, this method of providing support by basically asking financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, etc., to take the burden, that's not a viable way of resolving the problem. It has to mean that the government has to be willing to step up expenditure, even if the credit support is to be given through credit institutions. The government has to back it up with financial support, without which you'll end up with everyone keeps talking about twin balance sheet problem. There's a twin balance sheet problem there also between so many enterprises and the banks, and that's going to become worse. So financial support from the government is large financial support from the government is the backbone of everything else. Any measures that you're going to be taking. And that large financial support has to be met by or financed by, if not today, tomorrow at least, by imposing higher taxes on the corporate sector and so if they get a certain support, they should be made to pay back in the form of higher taxes. But not that you support you give to the people, you try and recover from them tomorrow.
Okay, let's just take the last question. What's your projection on where is the economy heading? Do you believe that we are in for negative growth rate for the next couple of years or longer? Where are we? Where are we going?
Well, let me put it this way that as things stand now, in terms of the other things remaining the same, the effects that uh, this coronavirus is producing of reinforcing the tendencies that already existed in the Indian economy, then we are in for a very severe contractionary phase. But of course, what finally happens will depend on several other factors. I am not really in a position to speculate, as some people are trying to do, about the more longer term effects of the epidemic. Okay. So, there are people in India who are very enthusiastic that somehow the effect of this epidemic, simply because it originated in China, people will now move out of China, and India is a good candidate to which investment will move, and therefore that offers an opportunity for India. Okay, I find it very little basis to be so enthusiastic about this. I mean, I don't see any reason why you should think that you're safer in India than in China if there's an epidemic. Because after all, India also locked down. So disruptions can happen more because of what happens in India, apart from other factors which have come in the way of India being used as a location for production for the world market. So people may look at it this way, but you can also see that the overall world economy's effects are also going to be negative. And large-scale restructuring of the world economy is not something that's going to happen in the next 1 or 2 years. It is a process that, if it is at all to happen, will take place over a longer period of time. So leave aside those long-term kind of effects, you would certainly see a much stronger contractionary tendency in the Indian economy. And if whether our GDP will measure it or not is a different matter, but strong contractionary tendencies will exist in the Indian economy unless, and I place more faith in the sphere of politics than in the government to bring about this change. The change in government policies required to address this issue, if at all it is to come, it is going to come in the sphere of politics. So I think what one has to look forward to is what's going to be happening in the political sphere in the coming days as in response to this particular crisis. And one hopes that eventually that process will tilt the balance a little bit more in favor of the 90% of the Indian population. Because if it does not, I think the only other option is going to tilt it even further against them.
Thank you. Thank you for this brilliant talk, for this wonderful overview of the economy and taking all these interesting questions. Thank you, everybody else. Thank you to the audience for joining. Before we close, let me just mention that tomorrow's lecture will be delivered by Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Jomo was Assistant Secretary General in UN DESA and Assistant Director General and Coordinator of Economic and Social Development at the FAO. He's he's a prolific writer, and he's going to be talking to us. His lecture is titled "The People United Will Never Be Defeated: Comparative Lessons for Containing COVID-19 Contagion." So hope to see you all once again tomorrow at 5:30. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.